says applause, so we know when to click. Hi, I'm Monsignor Patrick Garrity,
Nice to
Diocese
meet
of
you.
Knoxville.
Nice to meet you.
I hear
Brother
you're
John.
running this new program at St. Meinrad,
Well,
right?
we're trying, yeah.
Well, I come to investigate. See what this new program is.
He's the man for you to speak to. A
You
little
hold
teaser.
up signs with applause,
For
okay?
the applause or booze, right?
That's right, that's right.
And not the drinkable kind.
Well, that's the one thing I tell people about St. Meinrad. It always reinvents itself. There's always something
Yeah.
new coming on at St. Meinrad.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you all enjoyed lunch. And we are about to get started here. Thank you for being here. To introduce our presenter, we have Todd Gungle of the college class of 1997. He's celebrating 25 years here with us. And without further ado, let's have him come up.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Tim. Yes, it's my pleasure to be back here. I'm also on the Alumni board. It's proud to serve this place. So, as a member of the board, I get to introduce our speaker this afternoon. Brother John Glasenapp is the director of St. Meinrad's Institute for Sacred Music. He holds master's degrees in Catholic philosophical studies from St. Meinrad and in medieval studies from Fordham University. He earned his PhD in historical musicology from Columbia University, specializing in chant. His doctoral research was supported by the Alliance Council for European Studies and the U.S. Fulbright Program. He has spoken at numerous academic conferences in the United States and Europe, including those of the American Musicological Society, the International Medieval Congress, and the Cantus Planus Study Group of the International Musicology Society. His article, Nuns, Cistercian Chant, and Observant Reform in the Southern Low Countries, will appear in a forthcoming volume entitled Women and Monastic Reform in the Medieval West, circa 1900 to 1500, Debating Identities, Creating Communities. His research focuses on Cistercian chant, musical authority and reform, and later histories of manuscripts, and exchanges across religious groups, institutional boundaries, and gender. If you're fascinated by music and sound, you are in the right place. Brother John's presentation is entitled Sacred Song and Cosmic Harmony. Please join me in welcoming Brother John.
Thank you very much. It's good to be with you. I hope you're having a good time, although this talk is going to be kind of the vegetable course of, I hope, a rich weekend. So let's dive into some music theory. We live on the cusp of an incredible and unprecedented time in the life of the church, with the almost total loss of chant and most of the rest of the traditional repertoire of Catholic church music that had developed over the last 1,200 years. Vatican II opened up huge and unprecedented opportunities for new musical composition and choice. That freedom and flexibility, however, came at the expense not only of older styles of music, but also of traditional definitions of liturgical music and the accompanying commentary and theology on sacred music that applied to those older styles. If you're not already familiar, it's a voluminous body of writing. When we choose church music to perform these days, we're rarely trying to make grand metaphysical claims about the world. Our musical judgments are more often based on practicalities and accessibility. Does the congregation already know it? Who's going to complain about this one afterwards? And when we disagree and argue about music in church, rarely are we debating theology. Typically, we're discussing personal tastes and politics, with little historical or theoretical framework to lean on. Some might wonder if it's worth the hassle to include any music at all, or if it's necessary to pay our musicians for their service and training. In this post-conciliar shuffling and change, we might take for granted the most essential question: what makes sacred music sacred? What do you think? Some people say it's the text that makes music sacred, or its association with the liturgy, or the spiritual way it makes them feel. Others distinguish sacred music as religious music that is distinct from secular styles. But medieval Christians, adapting ideas from ancient Greece, had a much more sophisticated and holistic view. They found something inherently musical about the created world itself. They believed music held the cosmos together and bridged the natural world with the supernatural. And this musicality bore the fingerprints of God. Not only did Adam and Eve sing with the angels before the fall, everything that God made hummed together in a universal symphony. And this musicality bore the fingerprints of God. Only in hell, that place of isolation and noise, was there no music. In this talk, I'd like to start at the beginning, the very beginning, before there was a special category of sacred music, or even before there was music at all. The moment just before creation that started with a sound. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep. While a wind from God swept over the face of the waters, then God said, so begins the moment of creation. God uttered a sound, a first pulse of energy. God's sound created a wave, a disturbance, a vibration over that dark, formless void. In this story, creation began not simply as a divine thought that poofed into existence, or as God molding matter into shapes like a potter, but as an emission traveling through time and space as a wave of sound. Then God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God said, the second day. And God said. And there was evening and there was morning the third day. And God said, and saw that it was good the fourth day. And God said. Then God said, let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness. God saw everything that he had made, and indeed, it was very good. In the first and most famous creation story in the Bible, from Genesis 1, this is how God created the world in 6 days. The question I want to pose now is whether the Hebrew author is actually describing a musical event. Musical in the sense of ordered sound, or the process of making something material produce sound, sound that pulsates with energy. Was God's act of creation speaking over that formless void and causing it to resonate? In other words, is the world fundamentally a musical place? And if not, where does music come from? If it doesn't originate with God, how can any of it be called sacred? The prophet Isaiah recounts seeing, quote, the Lord seated on a high and lofty throne. Seraphim were stationed above. Each of them had 6 wings. They cried one to the other, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. All the earth is filled with his glory. At the sound of that cry, the frame of the door shook. In the book of Revelation, we encounter a similar vision of heaven that is loud, even deafening, and abuzz with activity. The passage begins, I, John, looked and heard the voices of many angels surrounding the throne and the living creatures and the elders. They numbered myriads of myriads and thousands of thousands, singing with full voice. And several verses before we read, they sing day and night without ceasing. To read these passages from both Isaiah and Revelation together in light of Genesis 1 suggests that God created the world in a way that very closely resembles heaven, loud, energetic, and incessantly, fundamentally, and thoroughly musical. If the ubiquity and creative power of heavenly sound is a major theme throughout the Bible, Genesis 1 and the other creation stories in the Old Testament have little to say about the musical relationships among God's creations produced through all this buzz. For questions like these, Christian theologians have frequently turned to ancient Greek philosophy for help. Music was an especial beneficiary of this cross-pollination, beginning with a Greek shaman named Pythagoras, who lived in the 6th century BC. Pythagoras might best be known for his formula to find the hypotenuse of a triangle, but in fact he is credited with a number of influential ideas, including the immortality of the soul. The philosopher Aristotle tells us that Pythagoras believed the world was fundamentally mathematical, and therefore that mathematics was a religious, mystical science that investigated the nature of all things. Pythagoras proposed that each number had special properties and meaning. For example, whether it was prime or divisible. He was especially interested in the relations between numbers, in other words, ratios. A famous legend recounts how he once walked past a blacksmith shop and noticed that the different pitches resulted when the blacksmith struck anvils with hammers of different sizes. When he reflected on the phenomenon, he realized that the differences in sound were the result of the proportional differences in the instrument, and therefore that musical pitch could be explained through mathematical ratios. Music, in other words, was simply sounded number. While the story of the blacksmith is apocryphal, the principle has been demonstrated since antiquity on something known as the monochord, which just means a single string. To get the different pitches of a musical scale, you pinch the string at different points. And I had planned to have a big cello up here to demonstrate, but I wasn't allowed because of this huge screen. This point, if you pinch it, creates an arithmetic ratio with the distance above and below the pinch. These ratios correspond exactly to the sound waves themselves. A ratio of 2 to 1 means the string is pinched exactly in the middle. It also means that the vibration produced is exactly twice as fast. In music, these two pitches are said to be an octave apart. And that's the difference between this half of one wave and then this full rotation of the wave there. What was so remarkable, even mystical for the Pythagoreans, was the discovery that the simpler the ratio, the lower on the what do I call that, number line? Yeah, number line, the more pleasing or consonant the sound is on our ears. So, for example, oh, can we open this? Yes. Since I couldn't get a real piano in here, we'll do this. So if I play, that's an octave. This should be the most pleasing sound in the sense that it overlaps the most consistently. The next simplest ratio, but beyond 2 to 1, is 3 to 2. And that sounds the next best, not quite as good. Can you hear a slight clash that is not present here? This is a little bit cleaner. A little less clean, but still goes well together, as does below. But by the time we get down to 9/8, the combination is ugly, disagreeable, or dissonant. And that, if I can get back to it, can be explained here. From the perspective of the area of physics that deals with sound, known as acoustics, the agreeableness or disagreeableness of these pitches to our ears matches how often these waves meet on the axis, how often they sync. If they sync a lot, we perceive that as pleasing. If they sync barely at all, lower on these, they only sync here every 7 times to every 6 times, unlike here, which is every other time. If they sync barely at all, we perceive that as a mismatch, as disturbing or revulsive. Our ears can effortlessly and innately tell how well 2 frequencies align, and we often assign aesthetic and even moral qualities to these mathematical relationships as either beautiful, good, or correct, or ugly, wrong, and requiring some kind of correction or resolution. But the philosopher Philolaus, for him, 2 dissonant pitches could still be considered harmonious even if they clashed. Harmony and pleasingness are different things, and harmony is more fundamental. All things, he argued, are a combination of unlimiteds and limiters, and I promise this is the most esoteric part of my talk. For 2 things to be harmonious, they must share an unlimited but differ in their limiters. Nevertheless, their limiters must still combine in some mathematical way, so harmony is essentially a mathematical relationship. Unlimiteds can be anything from basic materiality, such as the elements, air, fire, earth, water, or existence in time and space. And limiters can be any division of that, such as a particular time and space, or some particular shape or form. A rose and a daisy, for example, share all sorts of properties as flowers, but their geometric arrangement differs. Philolaus was the first person we know of to propose the Earth revolved around the sun, that the Earth orbits the sun at a certain speed and distance, and the moon around it are ultimately mathematical relationships that are harmonious. The Earth without the sun or moon would be radically transformed. Harmony, I want to emphasize, is not sameness or even necessarily likeness. It does not describe things that go well together like a s'more or banana split. Harmony is a principle of mathematical interconnectedness that runs through the cosmos and explains its interworkings and how it all fits as a unified whole. The pitches of the musical scale are also harmonious because they are derived from each other and exist in an arithmetic relationship. But pitches outside the musical scale are not harmonious. Pitches that are not on the keys on the keyboard, ones that fall in between. He writes, quote, "The scale provides Philolaus's only surviving explicit example of the bonding together of limiters and unlimiteds by a harmony. A musical scale presupposes an unlimited continuum of pitches. You could put your finger anywhere on that string, which must be limited in some way in order for a scale to rise. The crucial point is that not just any set of limiters will do. We cannot just pick pitches at random along the continuum and produce a scale that will be musically pleasing. The scale that Philolaus adopts is such that the ratio of the highest to the lowest pitch is 2:1, which produces the interval of an octave, as we've seen. That octave is in turn divided into a fifth and a fourth, which the 3:2 and the 4:3, which have the ratios 3:2 and 4:3, as I just said, respectively, and which, when added, make an octave. If we go up a fifth from the lowest note, and don't worry if you lose me here, in the octave, and then up a fourth from there, we will reach the upper note of the octave. Finally, the fifth can be divided into 3 whole tones, each corresponding. The point is they all derive from each other mathematically. Thus, in Philolaus' system, the fitting together of limiters and unlimiteds involves their combination in accordance with ratios of numbers. That's the key. Similarly, the cosmos and the individual things in the cosmos do not arise by a chance combination of limiters and unlimiteds. The limiters and unlimiteds must be fitted together in a pleasing way in accordance with number for an order to arise. Philolaus saw the cosmos as put together according to the diatonic, which is to say musical scale. This would be very much in accord with the famous conception of the harmony of the spheres, according to which the heavenly bodies make harmonious music as they move. But neither Philolaus nor any other early source neither in Philolaus or any other early source do we get an explicit account of how the musical scale corresponds to the astronomical system. What does all that mean? Harmony of the spheres. The Pythagoreans reasoned that the planets and stars and all the other bodies in space must each produce a pitch because of their immense size and speed, even though we cannot hear these sounds. They claimed that the pitches they produced corresponded to the ratios of a musical scale. They knew of 7 bodies in our solar system, including the sun and the moon, and there are 7 pitches in a musical scale. Then the octave for 8 starts the pattern over again. These celestial pitches combined harmoniously in an unending universal drone. In antiquity, this influential theory was called music of the spheres, or harmony of the spheres, or universal music. If you can see very closely here, this is not great. This is terra, this is the earth, and then we have agua, air, fire. This is the moon, Luna, Mercury, Venus, the sun is out here, etc. And this is a 12th century, from around the year 1100, map of the orbits. There's the sun, Saturn, Jupiter, Mercury, Venus. They were extremely, extremely aware and interested in the rotation of the heavenly planets. When we think of music, we think of one specific type, the type you hear on the radio or at a concert. In the early Middle Ages, however, they recognized several different types, 3 to be exact. The type that we understand as music, which we sing in church and play on the piano, was termed musica instrumentalis, instrumental music, created and performed by humans. It was the lowest on the food chain, even though it was the only kind of music we can actually perceive. The other 2, higher types of music, cannot be heard. The main overarching type was this inaudible planetary music in outer space called universal music, or in Latin, musica universalis or musica mundana. In between these 2 categories of music of the spheres and instrumental music, medieval thinkers proposed a middle category called musica humana, or human music, which is also inaudible. The 2 types of inaudible music are called speculative because we deduce that they exist, whereas instrumental music is practical because we create it with our hands. While Pythagoras and his many followers, including the philosopher Plato, were amazed that we can correctly perceive these mathematical relationships in sound so naturally and deeply, they were even more impressed that when we hear these sounds, especially strung together in a melody, we don't just evaluate them as good or bad. They move us. They affect our mood, thoughts, judgments, and even our bodies as our heart rate slows or speeds up according to the music. We relax, tense up, get excited, turn from sadness to joy. The tedium of work is lifted. We might even start to tap our toes in sync with everyone around us or dance to the beat. No other species on Earth has ever shared such a close connection to music or the ability to sync our actions in time, since ultimately matching a beat means predicting the future. So if I do this, you can match. No other species can do that. In fact, so innate is music to us as human beings, and so far down in the brain does it go, that we even describe ourselves as persons, which is related to the Latin verb per sonare, to sound through or resound, or a bit more technically, to vibrate with. For the 8th century Benedictine monk, Opert Ambrose, a person was one who channels the Holy Spirit as a literal instrument of God in the symphony of creation. Although the phrase instrument of God is one we often hear, we rarely consider its musical meaning. Ambrose does not mean a tool of God. He means that we, as persons, produce and amplify God's music. When God said, "Let there be," that sound sounded through. It animated. That sound vivified, brought matter to life, and the waters of chaos into order and relationship. A person is thus someone whose own body and soul were created in a musical harmony, an extension of God's hand in the world, and an amplifier, sounding board, or resonator of God's creative voice. Like the body of a cello, through which the vibration of the strings enters before it then spills outward in every direction. As such, a person is intellectually, physically, and psychologically attuned to the musical order of the world. We immediately grasp these patterns and see their interrelationships and commonalities in a way no other species has ever been able to. We are naturally drawn to symmetries, geometric shapes, and patterns in nature. They comfort, animate, and inspire us. But how do these numbers have so much power over us? How are we so in tune with them? Why do they resonate with us and even move us emotionally? Plato had one solution. Like several other ancient philosophers, he theorized that, quote, like is known by like. By that, he means that if we are able to perceive harmony in music and in the rotation of heavenly bodies, it is because our body and mind and soul must be harmonious in the same way. Discordant music upsets us because it resonates in our bodies in ways that destabilize the natural harmony of our bodies. Agitating sounds produce stress and anger, causing various undesirable physiological responses in the body. One of my friends in graduate school wrote his dissertation on court cases in which music, either produced or listened to, was used as legal evidence for prosecution. The fan base of the Detroit-based rap duo Insane Clown Posse, who refer to themselves as Juggalos, for example, was officially designated a criminal gang by the FBI. And just showing up to their concerts is considered incriminating evidence of affiliation. This group is automatically suspect of illegal activity based solely and entirely on the music that brings them together. Consonant music does the opposite. It promotes an individual's human music, or musica humana, the right ordering and coordinated function of our body and soul, so that heartbeat and breathing are in sync, and our mood and concentration are in equilibrium. As Hildegard of Bingen wrote in her letter to the prelates of Mainz, we sigh and moan with considerable frequency upon hearing some song, as we recall in our soul the quality of celestial harmony. The prophet David, considering with understanding the nature of what is spiritual, because the soul is harmonious, exhorts us in the psalm, "Let us confess the Lord on the kithara, let us play to him on the psaltery of 10 strings." Hildegard uses our impassioned response to music, rather than the lyrics themselves, as evidence that our souls are harmonious in the way that music is harmonious and the universe is harmonious. To praise the Lord on the harp is a spiritual act, she argues, not because God is attention-seeking and loves our flattering poetry, but because the act of creating music unites our soul with the mind of God, just like the choirs of angels, and opens our soul to perceiving God's musical and harmonious voice in the world. We are closest to God and to our own original perfection before the fall when we make and offer music to God. These 3 types of music, musica mundana or universalis, musica humana, and musica instrumentalis, were first formulated by a philosopher named Boethius, active in the early 500s. He's arguably the most important linchpin between the Western Church and Greek thought. In his book, De Institutione Musica, he wrote, quote, "For when we apprehend what in sounds is well and fitly combined, and take pleasure in it, we recognize that we ourselves are united by this likeness. For likeness is agreeable, unlikeness hateful and contrary. And there is some truth to music's ability to influence human behavior. When by this path rhythms and modes have reached the mind, it is evident that they also affect it and conform it to their nature." Sorry, there we go. As Daniel Chua, a leading musicologist, wrote, quote, "That human phlegm, the moon, and the Hyperidorean mode could inhabit the same site of logic was therefore due not to an aberration of reason, but to a musical logic that spun a web of similitude around the world." End quote. The cosmos was created harmoniously in a very real musical way. Now, at the midpoint of my talk, let me briefly review what I'm presenting and arguing. Somewhat fancifully, I've taken the story of creation from Genesis 1 and presented it in a bit more scientific light, that God's utterance injects the formless void with energy, order, and ultimately life in the form of a sound wave. I've grafted that telling onto the Greek view of the cosmos first proposed by Pythagoras and taken up by Plato and others. By defining music as sounded number, Christians in the West, namely Boethius, divided the Pythagorean, which is to say mathematical view, to include several kinds of music, some audible and others not, that underpin the whole of creation. All of this is incredibly important when we talk about sacred music in the Middle Ages, because at some level, the music sung in liturgy enjoyed a direct connection to the supernatural, even if that relationship was never quite defined. While this discourse of planetary music was more or less confined to the study of musica speculativa and astronomy, the mathematical ratios on which it was based were foundational for an emerging system of musical composition called counterpoint. And here, if you know Leonard Bernstein or his probably most famous composition, The West Side Story, here's him struggling to learn these rules as an undergrad at Harvard. Got a B- on this, and this wasn't the worst one. Chant, which I'll touch on, and he was still famous, so B- doesn't matter, it turns out. Chant, which I'll touch on a bit later, consists of one single line of music, pure melody, but another type that became increasingly popular in the Middle Ages and Renaissance, called polyphony, involved stacking several different lines of music together. So we think of this music both in horizontal terms, as several parts on top of each other, like a sandwich, or as vertical, because all of the pitches at any given moment are carefully arranged to produce a single, unified, and consonant whole. By the early 1400s, this style was known as the ars perfecta, the perfect art, and it dominated Catholic polyphony for at least 200 years. While Thomas Tallis would compose a motet in 1570 called Spem and Allium for 40 independent voices, early ars perfecta composers such as John Dunstable, who was also an astronomer and mathematician, by the way, typically wrote for 3 to 4 voices. In Quam pulchra est, all parts begin on a sustained unison. If you don't read music, you can just take my word for it. This is all the same note. On the second word, pulchra, right here, the outer voices break apart in contrary motion. The top voice gradually ascends, and the lower voice gradually descends. The outer voices reach their most distant pitches halfway through the first phrase before gradually coming back together to meet at the octave at the end of the first phrase in perfect symmetry. And let me play that if this works. Okay, nearly all the pitches are consonant. In other words, their ratios are simple and harmonize strongly. Dissonance is used sparingly and carefully, only 9 times to be exact, to create momentum and a greater sense of resolution at the end of the phrase. At no point does any one voice break free, dominate, undermine, or clash with any other voices. Let's see. There we go. It was a little tricky with these YouTube clips. There we go. As another example, about a century and a half later, the composer Orlando de Lassus wrote literally thousands of works in the Ars Perfecta style. Among these are settings of the 7 penitential psalms, commissioned in 1584 by King Charles IX of France. I'll play just a few seconds of this one as well so that you can get a sense of the sound. And I'd like you to think of that sound in terms of mathematics in motion, like the movement of the heavenly bodies in unbroken proportional relationships with each other. Sorry. You may notice that the piece does not sound particularly sad, even though the text is a penitential psalm. And in fact, this style of music responds weakly, if at all, to the meaning of the text. It is driven instead by number and counterpoint. The effect, for me, is one of suspense, even though there is almost constant churning among the parts. The voices move and interact, but without building tension or friction that requires resolution. So the music points to the present rather than anticipation of the future. The voices function as equals, though they are all different. Each is necessary, and no one dominates the others, as we find in modern music, with the primary melody on top and a subordinate accompaniment below. The rhythmic motion is regular and steady and avoids major breaks or pauses. It flows with an ethereal timelessness, though it is in time. This isn't just pretty music. There's a theological claim about the world being proposed here. This style of polyphony mimics the divine plan of creation and the interconnectedness of all that God made. Though the ars perfecta and Western music generally hardly has a monopoly on sophisticated mathematics and music, I'm thinking of the incredible complication of West African cross rhythms and the Prastara matrix in classical Indian ragas, or the tuning and rhythmic systems in Indonesian gamelan, on and on. But the art of combining notes in this way is distinctive and meaningful. That's what I did not want to happen. Yeah. Why does sacred music not sound like this now? And why is this Greek theory so new? If all this sounds totally unfamiliar, it's because we no longer think this way about music, the world, or our own bodies, much less their interconnectedness. As Richard Tarreskin, who just passed away a few weeks ago, described it in his monumental 5-volume Oxford history, quote, "The perfected art had an end, and it was near at hand at the end of the Renaissance. It had to be, for anything perfect in this world is doomed." I love that line. Perfection cannot change, yet nothing in human history stands still. The only way to preserve the perfected art was to seal it off from history. This was done, but the price was high. The ars perfecta still exists in Catholic circles, or if you go to Musica Sacra, the music school in Rome, for example, this is basically all you learn how to write. But not in a way that matters anymore. In the 16th century, it claimed all the greatest musical minds in Catholic Christendom. Later, it harbored non-entities. And the church that maintained its artificial life support system gradually lost its significance as a creative site for music. The 16th century was the last in which the music of the Catholic Church made history. From then on, it was history. Tarreskin is referring to the breakdown of the Greek notion of universal harmony in the modern period that I just described. For a number of reasons, not least of which was the revival of ancient Greek music theory in the Renaissance by humanists such as Vincenzo Galilei. Vincenzo Galilei was the father of the astronomer Galileo Galilei, and I hope it's now clear how a musician and astronomer might come from the same family, who discovered that the orbit of the planets could not possibly conform to the ratios of the musical scale. Thus, the harmony of the spheres began its slow collapse as a reputable theory and led to a crisis of catastrophic proportions for music, astronomy, science, and religion. The consequence was that music lost its place among the sciences in the 7 classical liberal arts. Music, and to some extent theology, became an art, closely allied instead with rhetoric. Musica universalis and musica humana ceased to be current, and music was reduced to musica instrumentalis. It was thus severed from both the created order and the supernatural. As a purely human-made form of expression, it became a tool of persuasion rather than a principle of cosmic harmony. The goal of music in the Renaissance and beyond was to make you feel how I feel, especially by emphasizing the meaning of the text. Some Protestant reformers even treated music as a worldly distraction, an obstacle to the divine. In religious circles, music was best used as an evangelical tool to persuade and rally the crowds to devotion. Whatever worked to influence, popular songs that galvanized a group, simple tunes that easily engaged a congregation, music with great emotional appeal served the purpose. Hopefully this sounds more familiar. Increasingly, religion too retreated from both math and science into the isolated preserve of personal belief and conviction. But in our current musical moment, I think we're overdue to revisit and reevaluate some of these ancient ideas in light of recent developments in astrophysics, acoustics, and neuroscience. Regarding the highest form of music, Musica Universalis, we now have confirmation that the bodies in space do, in fact, produce a constant and inaudible sound, or really a chorus of sounds, which NASA has made audible for us, even if it is not exactly what Pythagoras expected it to be. I'd like to play the first 2 minutes of one of their clips to give you a sense of what Musica Universalis might sound like in the 21st century, or how we might understand Genesis 1:3. Then God said, "Let there be light," as music.
You're actually hearing the vibration of the sun. It almost has a warmth to it. It's just enough where I can almost feel the sound on my skin or on my clothes. I imagine feeling the sun, moving next to me. My name is Alex Young, and I am the Associate Director for Science in the Heliophysics Science Division here at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center. When anything material moves, waves travel through it, and the same thing happens inside the sun. And these waves are traveling, bouncing around inside the sun. And if your eyes were sensitive enough, you'd actually could see this jiggle. But what scientists have done is they've taken that jiggle and turned it into sound, into a sound that we can hear with our own ears. The sun is vibrating at lots of different frequencies. And one of the things that's pretty cool about that is we can use those vibrations in the sun to look inside the sun. We don't have straightforward ways to look inside the sun. I mean, we don't have a microscope to zoom inside the sun. So using a star or the sun's natural vibrations allows us to see inside of it. And we can see huge rivers of solar material flowing around. We are finally starting to understand the layers of the sun and the complexity. It's really cool because all of this complex motions inside the sun are in fact what generates magnetic fields inside the sun. And those magnetic fields float up to the surface and give us sunspots. And those sunspots give us solar flares and coronal mass ejections, this whole thing we call space weather. So all of these things are connected. And that simple sound is giving us a probe inside of a star. I think that's a pretty cool thing.
All of these things are connected. The New York Times recently published an article entitled, "Hear the Weird Sounds of a Black Hole Singing," as if it's a new discovery that the heavens sing, that the Greeks over 2,500 years ago did not already anticipate. Oh. Pretty freaky. Though not exactly what medievals meant by the second type of music, musica humana, the harmony between body, mind, and soul, the avant-garde composer John Cage did famously announce certain musical properties of the human body and the impossibility of experiencing true silence. He explains it here. One day.
anechoic chamber.
Sorry, let's go back to the beginning.
It was after I got to Boston that I went into the anechoic chamber at Harvard University.
Which is to say sound.
Anybody who knows me knows this story. I am constantly telling it. Anyway, in that silent room, I heard two sounds, one high and one low. Afterward, I asked the engineer in charge why, if the room was so silent, I had heard two sounds. He said, "Describe them." I did. He said the high one was your nervous system in operation. The low one was your blood in circulation.
So true silence is impossible. Regarding Philolaus's conception of harmony, sound, whether inaudible or not, does actually bind all of creation together. In an article in Scientific American, published in 2018, Tam Hunt describes this sonic binding. He writes, quote, "All things in our universe are constantly in motion, vibrating. Even objects that appear to be stationary are in fact vibrating, oscillating, resonating at various frequencies. Resonance is a type of motion characterized by oscillation between two states. And ultimately, all matter is just vibrations of various underlying fields. An interesting phenomenon occurs when different vibrating things or processes come into proximity. They will often start, after a little time, to vibrate together at the same frequency. They sync up, sometimes in ways that can seem mysterious. This is described today as the phenomenon of spontaneous self-organization. Examining this phenomenon leads to potentially deep insights about the nature of consciousness and about the universe more generally. Hunt claims that we are literally moved by the movement. We exist in relationship and interaction with all else that exists, even on a subatomic level. And that relationship depends on the element of sound. Ancients and medievals already understood this in a profound way. How music moves us, either physically or emotionally, is currently a robust field of research that lies at the intersection of psychology, neuroscience, and music theory. The cognitive psychologist Steven Pinker once called music auditory cheesecake because, like cheesecake, music excites parts of the brain that he argues ultimately serve other purposes. We are not designed by nature to eat cheesecake. We just like it. Others, such as the neuroscientist Charles Limb, have countered that music lights up more parts of the brain than any other human activity and is therefore far too complex to be accidental. Instead, Limb proposes that the human brain is adapted precisely for music. But Hildegard of Bingen made the similar observation in the 12th century when she reasoned that Adam and Eve only sang in the garden and speech is merely a consequence of sin. Broken down song. So, what does any of this material have to do with determining what makes sacred music sacred? In fact, the ethnomusicologist Phil Bowman once inverted the question and asked, is all music religious? Does not all sound, all energy, harmony, and life ultimately go back to God's 6-day spoken word marathon in Genesis 1? Music alters our perception of time, mood, and even of our own bodies in ways that human communities throughout the world and across history have recognized as restorative, transcendent, mystical, and, in a word, spiritual. Musical repetition, in particular, allows us to anticipate the future so that it doesn't occupy us, and our attention becomes focused on smaller and smaller durations in the present. Many neuroscientific studies about this. We forget about our bills and responsibilities and to-do lists and enter into a state sometimes called trance or even ecstasy. Under the influence of music, or rather by coming together with others through music, our own boundaries and sense of isolation from one another crumbles, And we bond with those around us to such an extent that we might even entrust perfect strangers to toss and catch us in midair with total abandon and complete trust that their interests are my interests because we are experiencing the same music together. There is only communion. Imagine for a second what would happen if the power went off and the music suddenly stopped. Who are you? Get away from me. Why are you touching me? But in this musically altered state, do we not get a sense of what life in the garden was once like? Chant and sacred music developed independently of theories about universal human and instrumental music, but it accords well with them. I hope you have felt this way, this woman feels, either at liturgy or a prayer service or at some other moment in your life, both swept into the present and in perfect unison with the group and your surroundings, while totally removed from all fear, doubt, and anxiety. This is what the spiritual life looks like, even if prayer isn't usually this fun or wild. Chant is in free rhythm, meaning there is no regular beat. Its time is not the mechanized tick of a clock, but it requires a collective, intuitive, and dynamic sense of moving together in time. Chant consists of a single line of music in which all voices join together and mix harmoniously. The air that normally divides us is transformed into the place where our voices connect and blend. Choral chant is egalitarian, free, beautiful, and ultimately a utopian vision of what could be. Almost without fail, when I'm asked to speak about sacred music, people expect to hear my recommendations of the composers and pieces that I think rate the best. But that is too narrow a view. It misses very real practicalities that are different in various times and places, but it is also not ambitious enough. Sacred music should make claims about the Catholic view of the world, human nature, our ability to understand God and ourselves, and even the limits of language at describing what is ultimately mystery. There are plenty of composers at work on these theological issues, and as we move farther and farther away from the Second Vatican Council, more and more music will hopefully respond to it, and parishes will move beyond the so-called four-hymn sandwich. If you haven't heard that expression, everything being a hymn. In the meantime, we should not forget that what makes sacred music sacred is not just the notes or the text. It is also how we sing and listen, and to what end. Does it build us up, or are we too busy fighting about our personal preferences? Does it take us out of our immediate concerns and cause us to think differently about ourselves and one another? After all, listening to others around us is also part of full, conscious, and active participation. As we march ahead in our own lives like one line of music in a 7 billion-voiced Ars Perfecta composition, do our movements and decisions take into consideration our relationships with those around us, or are we creating noise and dissonance with our neighbors in the name of personal autonomy, or simply forgetting to pay attention and the rules of harmonious living? Let me end with an image from the opening page of the manuscript I wrote my dissertation on that expresses a particular theology of sacred music and liturgical chanting well. On the first page of this volume, for First Vespers of Easter Sunday, the A of Alleluia is illuminated. The crossbeam of the letter separates two scenes. What scene is at the top? Can you see? It's an angel, yeah, the angelic choir of heaven. And what is happening at the bottom? That might be a little harder. Exactly, yes. Jesus is at the gates of hell. He's standing on top of Satan, who is shackled, and the hell mouth has been opened, and Adam and Eve are the first to emerge. A small devil stands on top of the hell mouth, paralyzed and helpless to fight back. Why? What is he doing? It might be very hard to see. But the Alleluia the nuns of this community intone for Easter is the same one the angels in heaven sing. Their chant is a torment to hell and the sound of liberation to the souls that are freed. The devil is clasping his ears because he's hearing the song of heaven above, which is torture to him, and it paralyzes him. By chanting the liturgy, the nuns extend the kingdom of God to the gates of hell and allow us to peer into the heavenly vision that awaits us. Thank you. Either now or afterwards, but.
Questions, if anyone has any for him.
I kind of threw the kitchen sink at you.
You did. Well, let's hear it again. Oh, wait, I have one over here. Let me. I got a microphone.
My question, I guess, relates toward where you were going, but most of what you talked about is Western thinking, right? And Western philosophy and theology and so on.
Sure.
What about like in China and India and places that have a totally different tonal scale?
Yes. I know less about that. I mean, I only gave an overture to that music theory. Another friend of mine actually wrote her dissertation on early contacts between the Jesuit missionaries to China in the 18th century. And in part, the emperor was interested in Western music, but he was really interested in Western science and these connections. What Chinese cosmology was in the 17th and 18th century is not a field of expertise, but certainly this is not unique to Christianity, and for the most part we imported it from Greeks. We're not the only ones to import Greek thought. And so this is, I think that I do want to emphasize that this is not something that Western Europeans have a monopoly on. Even in the Eastern Church, they have a very different approach that's nonetheless very principled. I think the point is that music does speak deeply to not only theology, but even like scientific understandings of how the world works. And so this is the tradition that I'm most familiar with, that we're a part of. But this is almost taken for granted in the ancient world. And in many places still is a robust way of thinking and hearing and experiencing music, because they did not undergo the kind of modern crisis that the West experienced. But I wish I could have a fuller answer to that. But is anybody else expert in?
Sort of.
Yeah.
As a Navy chaplain retired, I got to travel the world. As a former music teacher, I collected instruments. Your theory works perfectly about the unification of all mankind in all cultures. One, I can point out, if you ever seen a Irishman or Scottish bagpipe, the melody instrument, the shan, you open it up, there'll be double reed. It'll be a double reed instrument, fingering. Over in China, I picked up one, has a brass bell, has a bamboo. It too is a double reed, and all the same mathematical alignment of the holes for the pitch. And he explained it perfectly. But I found it interesting. You can go around the world, and percussionists all know you'll find drums on whatever they could make them out of. And they would tune the drums from the wooden ones you'd find, and the metal ones you've heard, and the tuned timpani. But that same theory works to all of humankind around the world. It's beautiful for an explanation. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Ultimately, it's scientific based in the natural world that then becomes also a religious claim on the world, but it's not. This isn't based on revelation. We call it natural theology or physics. that they didn't make that separation until really the modern period. Yes, please.
This is kind of a comment that tees off the last comment. In my interest in folk dancing, I once read a book, and you may be familiar with this book. It's called Keeping Together in Time, Dancing, Drill, and Human History. And I don't remember too much about it, but one of the theories was the first army that marched to the sound of drums together easily defeated the other armies.
Mm-hmm.
So my question to you is your comments on the power of music to create community and unify people. If you have any thoughts on that issue.
Yeah, I have a lot. This is a very important question, and it's an open-ended question. If we think of a scene like this, I like, well, both scenes, but this one in particular from an evolutionary biological point of view, there are a lot of calories being burned for no end. This would seem to be to put our species in peril. We're wasting food for no reason. What is the advantage? There must be something here that's advantageous, that helps us survive, that makes our life better. What is that exactly? We could say human community. There seems to be something social about that, but also something even emotional, that it helps us live better, more productively in other ways, even though this seems to be a waste. But I was struck, I took a course on medieval military history, and the three things that would get a general in trouble all the time: he didn't bring enough priests, so they did not have spiritual support. He drove the troops too hard, so they got dehydrated, and when they did stop, they ended up drinking too much wine, got drunk, and they were all killed. Or was cheap on the musicians, so they weren't properly together. They didn't get enough bagpipers and enough drummers, and so they were uncoordinated. And this comes up over and over and over again in these medieval chronicles, which is so fascinating. You would think it would have more to do with like weapons and defenses or something, or strategy, but that doesn't usually come up. It's the musicians, because it helps the group cohere, and it motivates the group and gets them into battle. It gets them to run to their death, which you normally wouldn't do. You have to be in kind of an altered state to take that level of risk. And music seemed to be a necessary tool to do something that is, we might call it altruistic, or at least selfless, something against our own inclinations. So I think that music is something that's so familiar, so ubiquitous to us, that we take it for granted, and we kind of don't even really think deeply about why we're doing what we're doing, or why we're spending all this money and energy and time. Why you've been sitting here for an hour and 15 minutes listening to me talk about this. What is it all? Where's it all going? And I mean, in the medieval period, they would say, well, this is a memory, as Hildegard says, a memory of she calls it the musical science with which we fell asleep after the fall of Adam and Eve. This is a memory of our spiritual calling, of our innate perfection. If you don't have that Christian view, and you're an evolutionary biologist, this is an open question, and that we and we alone as a species, not only can we do this, but we enjoy doing this, and we spend a lot of resources doing music. So, yeah, it's a thought to ponder over, but it's one that I think has stumped a lot of scientists, a lot of sociologists, a lot of anthropologists, a lot of psychologists.
It came to mind to me as I was listening to the recent comments here. About 20 years ago, I was at a human resource conference, and they had a gentleman there named Arthur Hull, who leads drumming circles. And so they were having this event out in this open atrium area. There were probably 400 people there. He only had so many rhythm instruments to hand out, but he started this rhythmic chant, and then later we all joined in as it got more complex. It was one of the most memorable things I've been through in my life, in that at the end he asked the group to comment on the experience. People were lifted to this spiritual plane. Mm-hmm. We talked about unity and community and love and caring. There was never a word spoken other than his directions. So you're right. It's almost like we tapped into a dimension of ourselves that we didn't realize. And it was extremely rich and extremely memorable and very congruent with many of your comments about how we tap into this universal flow with all of this.
Yeah, when Hildegard speaks of singing to the Lord, that's what I mean. I think she's referring to that act rather than singing psalms. I mean, so often we think of prayer as just like reciting text out of a book or something. And I want to say that's not prayer, but that's not what Hildegard is referring to. She's referring to that, of being taken out of yourselves and to look at each other and the world around you in a different way, a way where things connect, that are harmonious, that are purposeful, a larger view. This is a contemplative vision and music, as you were saying, allows us in this window that is otherwise fairly inaccessible to us. We might have a moment of apotheosis, a moment of watching as we speak. My sister is in labor, with a new niece that I'll be meeting right after this. That's one of these moments of like spiritual power, or even being with somebody as they die. But those are fairly rare. But for some reason, music is this site of mystery and transcendence, and it also allows us to get over the limitations of language. But also, not only does it affect us, but this crowd, I love this image, it affects us all in the same way. Nothing needs to be said, because we all just sort of get on this same wavelength. And part of that is physiological. If I do this, not only can you do it, but if I do this long enough, all of our heartbeats will eventually match that pitch. So it affects us below the level of cognition, as you would say. So this is why, like at a gym or at a mall or even in an elevator or office, they play a certain music with a target heart rate, because as you sit there all day, your job, for example, if you're sitting in an office, will not want you to fall asleep. So they will, but they also don't want you to get too exhausted or agitated. So there's a perfect heart rate that they can manipulate by piping music in. And people make a lot of money studying this sort of thing. But
could you talk about the connection between music and emotion? So, for example, we have certain kinds of music that rouses us up, like a fighting song at a football game. Other music that makes us very sad. Others that brings us feeling of elation, and others sorrow, just different emotions. And how does that work? Because it certainly works.
Yeah, again, it's such a common phenomenon, and yet we really don't know. There's a very robust field now called, in the humanities, about the history of emotions, whether all cultures and all times and places experience the same thing. Do we all, when we say happiness or to be in love, do we all mean the same thing? Are we all feeling exactly the same thing? And how does that work? We often talk about music as being a universal language. I think most scholars are uncomfortable with that language. Is our sad music sad to everybody, or does it just sound weird? There's a lot of indication that it just sounds weird, that a lot of it is cultural. So it's difficult to, music is so semantically slippery. And on the other hand, it's not all culture, because as I was just saying, it does go very deep in the brain below the level of cognition. It acts on us. I mean, even, as a kid, I'd fall asleep and I'd have nightmares because I was hearing my dad watching some action movie or something, and that was invading my thoughts as I was sleeping. I wasn't even aware of it. Very often there was a British popular music historian called Simon Frith, who said that on average in this study, and this is an older study now, but that the average person listened to about 8 hours of music a day and was aware of almost none of it. But again, and they're meant not to know of it. When you don't hear so much as like shopping of like Muzak and stuff, but it used to be that music was piped into all kinds of public places, workplaces, in part for crowd control, to get you to shop more, to get you to relax, quiet down, but to manipulate you. But yeah, why music moves us, that's ultimately what is driving all the Pythagoreans 2,500 years ago, and Hildegard and Boethius, as to understand how does music move us? how does it move us so deeply in ways that are not just emotional, but even these contemplative visions and, very, very deep. And I mean, the short answer is we really don't know. And so the hot field in the humanities is actually the neuroscience right now. About 10 years ago, everybody was doing anthropology, but neuroscience is kind of where all the rage, and this nature versus nurture question is really important. Even studying fetal responses to music, it goes so deep because music or sound is the first sense that we develop in the womb. So we come out, we already have associations of sound before we're born. And how all that works is just crazy. I was giving I was talking about sacred music and chant to this group of lay degree students here, and one of them happened to be a music therapist. And her specialization in music therapy was actually preemies in the NICU, and using music to help brain development with babies, just using gradually introducing more and more sophistication of sound, which is just say stimulation, just to allow the brain time to develop and connect, but using sound to do that, to plug these different regions of the brain, as I was saying before with, I don't know which slide it is, but here, that our brains are adapted to music. Music uses more parts of the brain than anything else. Music is very, very important in a music therapy sense for preemies and NICU to make sure that all these connections are happening. Not only is it emotional, we talk about emotions moving us, but we also move physically. And I'm not a neuroscientist, but last I heard, those parts of the brain are very close together, and so there may be some accidental firing which makes us want to move. But that does not explain how we can move perfectly to the beat. We're not just doing this, which would suggest a neural firing, like an accidental process. We conform to the music. That's much, much more complicated. And again, humans are the only ones to do it. We don't have any other group to study. So it's a mystery. But again, that's why music has so fascinated theologians. It's so powerful, but such a mystery. But if you figure it out, let me know. Yeah. Because it manipulates your perception, your attention, your perception of duration, and focuses your attention on again, as all music follows a beat, for example, and that beat, because it's regular, will draws you into that pattern, because you kind of know what's going to happen in the future. You know this is going to continue, so you don't have to kind of wait with all your senses firing to know what's going to happen. And this again just happens below the level of cognition. You relax into it and focus in the present in shorter and shorter durations, shorter and shorter periodicity, and again, how and why, tons and tons and tons of studies, whole books. One book that is a really great synthesis of a lot of this work is called On Repeat by Elizabeth Margulis. She did an NPR interview about this, really, really fascinating. Music theorist, formerly a Columbia grad, and really, really, really interesting. And how it's used in everything. Music is used from everything from to help study, to calm hyperactive children, to calm autistic people, to trance and ecstasy, and all sorts of applications. It's extremely, extremely fascinating. I don't know if that answered your question, but yeah. but in terms of studying, yeah, it does seem to focus the mind on one goal. If all neurons are firing, and they're all firing in one direction, rather than worrying about this and that and multitasking.
Well, I know our time is about up, but whatever drew us to St. Meinrad, I think the one thing that we all know and can appreciate is their constant pull to people of beauty, of trying to find what is beautiful and helping us do that. I know in my time here, great work with Father Columba, Brother Samuel. I used to love going over to the Archabbey and being able to participate in liturgies over there and such. And what you talked about, those few ecstasy moments that I've had in my life, I can attribute to being over in the Archabbey Church, being able to participate in that. So it's great. Brother, we thank you for your presentation. And I'm sure everyone here would join in me. Prayer for the Holy Spirit would be with your sister, and congratulations and thank you. Let's hear it for Brother John one more time. All right, enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and we'll see you at dinner.
Thank you very much. Should I turn this off?